We are joined now by Sal Tivy Perks, who can rightly be called the matriarch of Ireland's first family of entertainment. Sal, how are you?
I'm great.
That's a big title to load onto somebody as the matriarch of anything, but to explain to people who have never been to Perks in Youghal, it is this wonderful Coney Island style experience where you go in, you've got trampolines, you've got carousels, you've got bowling. It's everything, all kinds of fun under one roof. Tell me more about it.
Well, it's 77,000 square feet under one roof, under one big, huge umbrella. And just like you said, we have bowling and laser and kiddies play, jungle gym, and we have a restaurant and we have kiddie rides, all under one roof in Youghal.
My daughter loves the carousel, and it is this beautiful ornate carousel, but there's a great story behind it. How long has it been
It's
around?
Italian. The majority, in fact, the home of all carousel making is in Italy. And our carousel has not been in my family now, but it has come down, that we bought it. It's 180 years old, and it's a beautiful centrepiece to any amusement centre. So we love it very much, and adults and little children ride together on it, which is a lovely thing nowadays.
I've been on it many times. That's why I ask you about it. You have this wonderful family history, because this is the latest incarnation of the family business. And yes, many Americans watching this will understand how over the years your family literally had to be pulling themselves up by the bootstraps to keep going. So tell us about that family history.
Well, the family history began, of course, with my father, because we will be 90 years in business next year. But however, my father, as a very young boy, his father died of, they used to call it consumption in those days, which was tuberculosis. And he left my grandmother, my father's mother, in a very bad position, and those were very, very hard times. And he was 8 years old, and not when his father died, and he had to start things like, my grandmother was a musician, and she used to teach music, but at that stage the recession had arrived, and
the Great Depression.
The Great Depression, yeah, and nobody was taking music lessons by any means, and they had done well when they started off, myself and my grandfather, but things went very low. So anyway, she used to play the piano in the silent movies, like the silent movies, and my father played the violin, and my aunt, who was older again, played the harp, and Charlie Chaplin style music.
So they would have been at the front with the black and white movies, yeah, providing the soundtrack live.
Yeah, going with the wording underneath of what was happening. He said this in black and white, the writing. And this is what he did as well. But after school every day, he had to shovel coal into the bags. Now, he was only 8, which is quite a feat of engineering. But at that stage, as my father said to me, people today say, oh, I'm hungry, and they haven't the remotest idea what hunger is.
There was an entrepreneurial fire burning when he was shoveling that coal, and it manifested itself then in a different way. So they moved on from musical accompaniment, yeah, to what next?
The next thing was, of course, all the time they were looking for work, and into town came this fun fair. And in those days, a fun fair wasn't roller coasters and big wheel and all that. It was just stalls, hoopla, hook-a-duck, all this sort of thing, prize stalls. This was what it was. And it was Caledonian Amusements at George MacDonald, which finished up as my grandfather. But however, at this stage, my grandmother discovered they were looking for a fortune teller. So she said it to my father, and he said, well, what do you know about fortune telling? So she said, well, I'm going to have a go. So she digged herself up in her fortune teller as much as she could, and she went down, and from my grandfather, George MacDonald, she got the job. So she started off anyhow, and she was a really feisty woman, she died when she was 98, and even then she had a stroke and so forth, but she was she dickied herself up every day with her good hand and the earrings and everything. And anyhow, she went down. She had no problem. She was telling the fortune. And like all people, you know, and I find even in my business, they'd have a son or a daughter, and they'd say, by the way, would you have any positions open? And she said, I have a son. So my grandfather, this George MacDonald, said, yes, we have a position. And the steam engines, which was like the lorry of those days that used to draw all the loads, the wagons, as they were called, along, used to stand by as be the powerhouse, because you shovel coal into it, you know, fired up, and that would give light to the bulbs, bare bulbs, round the stalls, so there'd be some light for them to operate at night.
Creating this magical effect, as
Yes.
it would have been at the time when electricity wouldn't have been that common in the country. To see electric light probably would have been almost an inspirational
thing.
Yeah.
And on top of which, remember, in those days there was no television, there was no radio, there was nothing. So any shows that came to Belfast or any small towns, it was a big thing. You know, people went out.
And how then
did he finish up
did
there?
he finish up there?
Well, at one night, anyhow, my uncle, which would be my grandfather's son, am I confusing you there? No. Was sick, and he did the roulette, you know, operated the roulette. Do you know what I mean now? The big roulette.
The big roulette.
Yeah. And my grandfather, this George MacDonald, said to my father, can you count? And he was quite insulted. And he said, of course I can count. So he put him to work on this. And he was faster, you know, quicker to add and subtract and so forth. And anyhow, he was kept on at that. And that was his jobs. And also any maintenance of things that were around, and he started to travel with the fun fair. But in the meantime, he had met my mother, and they fell in love at 18, and they weren't allowed to marry till they were 25. So anyway, and chaperoned everywhere. Anyway, at 25 they got married, and both Mommy and Daddy had decided they certainly did not want to stay with her parents, you know, or his parents-in-law. So they secretly, my father was making stalls himself, you know, the same stalls there. And anyhow, they were making these stalls. He was making these stalls, and he also carved a carousel. And of course, it was sold. I'd give anything to find it nowadays. I'm sure it's broken up. But anyhow, once they got married and got going, they told my grandfather they were leaving, and there was wigs on the green, murder. So they were virtually put out. So anyhow, the place they found to go into was Limerick, the centre of Limerick city. And it was an indoor place, like. And they'd very little stuff, like. They hadn't much compared to my grandfather. So my father got the idea that he came in at lunchtime the first day and held up all the traffic. And you know, the cars that were then. And then he waited till midnight and he went out again, and he came in the next day at lunchtime. And he did this 4 times. And people were saying, my God, this must be a massive fun
What an amazing show.
What an amazing show. And anyhow, when he opened, just the creme de la creme of it all was my mother set off down to the wholesaler, who she knew well from buying stuff from for her father. And he said, I'm afraid I can't give you any credit, because your father told me if I did, he would not do business with me again.
It was really difficult to have to do that. If you had acrimony in the family, if you had some measure of dispute and you didn't have much to begin with, it must have been a hard start for them to set up that business when they didn't have much.
Indeed, it must have been, but there were 2 young couple who were madly in love, and they wanted to go out on their own. And my father was very courageous. And I suppose no wonder he was when he started at 8, playing the violin in the movies. So he wasn't afraid of anything.
And what did they do, though, to convince people to come through the doors? Because they had to have something to win.
In the beginning, what they did was their stalls, and I suppose my mother was very creative. As I mentioned to you, she couldn't get credit. So what she did is she put her wedding presents out in the stall, which is very courageous, really, when you think about it. But they had great ideas, and when you're young, I think you don't worry so much. And I suppose in those days they'd no hope of going back. They had to go forward.
It was a difficult birth for the company, but it went from strength to strength. What's your first memory of it?
My first memory of it was, I think, a train, a kiddie ride train we have, you know, of at home. We still kept it. And I think that when I was about 7 or 8, I was sent to boarding school very young, for the simple reason that travelling with the fun fair meant that you didn't get any education. So I have 2 brothers older than me, and they were sent to college, to boarding school very young. And any people in the fun fair business generally send their children at a very young age. Otherwise, you can't go from town to town and keep moving them from school to school. So the beginning of my era was the fact that what you did first was you picked up the rings in the hoopla. You know, the operator would operate, and I suppose it was babysitting in its own way,
Yeah.
but the operator would be selling way up. And my job, or anybody like cousins or anything in their business, that's later on in time, picked up the rings and put them ready for sale again. So that was the first I can remember of actually.
Did you remember this as being special? I mean, lots of kids who are working in family businesses always go, oh, it's just a job. But did you realise that this was different? You weren't like the other kids. You were involved in the fun fair. You were involved in the carnival.
Well, you see, the beauty of it was it would move every 2 or 3 weeks. And that was the beauty, that was something new and exciting. It wasn't the same day-to-day dull thing that I suppose other people have to stay in one place. And with fun fair, and I'd say with theatre and anything to do with that, the arts as such, there's always something interesting, something exciting, sometimes something terrible, but there's always something happening. And the word is happening.
You've given us the journey from that humble beginning of the 8-year-old filling the bags of coal, to the steam engine, to the fun fair in Limerick, to the travelling fun fair, to where you are now. But you've accrued all of this knowledge, and it's knowledge that has been tapped by others. What's this about the Chinese government asking you for help with fun fairs?
Every winter, this is when Philip and I now, this is only 20 years ago now. Philip and I are in business ourselves as part of Perks for 40 years, 45 years. And in the winters, that was the killer, because you couldn't operate and you couldn't find big enough places to operate indoors. So a friend of ours had pubs, a nephew of mine had pubs in Hong Kong first. And he knew of a site which was beside the Opera House there. And he talked, there was English people, English agents bringing over, we'll say, Phantom of the Opera and all this sort of thing at Christmas. So we got ourselves wangled into that and operated there and went on from there for about 5 years, 5 winters. And what we'd do is we'd load up in Youghal into containers,
So
the Miceal and roller coaster.
You loaded the whole equipment in Ireland?
Yes.
And brought it?
It took 3 weeks to get out there. We'd fly out there with our staff, it'd come off and we'd build it there. And we did this, and several times the Chinese people, business people, came down and said, would you bring it to the China, to the mainland? And we chatted with, one was a lawyer, an Irish lawyer from Waterford, who'd been there for about 30 years. And he said, don't touch them in case you don't come back with only your suitcase and no equipment. But one day this American Chinese gentleman came to us, and he was representing China Resources, which is the very big part of China that was down in Hong Kong. This was before the takeover now, the take back. And he asked us would we fly up and look at and meet them, and we met members of the government, and they showed us the site. And what they were actually building was a huge sort of a Disney site. A Disney site. They had hotels, they had shops, there's this, they had that, and they wanted an amusement park. So when you go to China, this is 20 years ago now, you have to take a Chinese partner, but the Chinese government must choose your partner. You never know who your partner is until you arrive there. And we got a woman, she was tough stuff, but she was great. And we built the park. My husband Philip's an engineer, so that was great. And there were a lot of engineers sent up from Hong Kong and the mainland themselves, so it was good. It was huge. We had 5 roller coasters, which is, so it was 3 acres of fun fair, of every description, shape and size. But we were in joint venture with them. And that was the way it worked. That's the way it works up there.
There's a connection with Disney. Tell me about it.
Right. My father was a friend of Walt Disney's so long ago. And his vice president, we knew because we used to meet him every year at an organisation called IAAPA, International Association of Amusement Parks and Attractions. And at one stage, anyhow, he came to Ireland to visit and undercover. And he stayed with us where we live in the Front Strand. And we had a pub at one time called Clancy's, which is still there now. It's somebody else, of course, many somebody else's then. So he was marvellous. He used to clear the tables and clear the glasses, and nobody knew that he was anything to do with Disney. But he was there, and when Warren was born, he asked if he could be his godfather. And as time passed, his wife died in an accident, and a few years later he married again, and he came over to Ireland and spent his honeymoon with us. So the poor darling has passed away now, I'm sad to say, but he was a wonderful man.
But there has been a great link with other Americans. Tip O'Neill, the famous US politician, he actually came to your site, didn't he?
Tip O'Neill was on the stand on the Mall in Cork, the South Mall, on Patrick's Day, and we had a very big float. And it was Perky Bear, my costume character's 10th year.
I remember Perky Bear.
You do? And anyway, we stopped in front of our Tip O'Neill and we got off and we went up to him, we got a kiss, and I met him after a kiss. He was a very sweet gentleman. I met him afterwards in the City Hall, and I must say he was an absolute darling.
So next year is the 90th anniversary. They started at the time of the Great Depression, the Wall Street crash of 29. We talked about the difficulties they had. The effect of that crash felt all the way over here in Ireland. But, you know, when you're looking at it now and what you've planned for next year, is it exciting? I mean, do you see Ireland as being very different country to what it was 90 years ago? And what do you think American visitors will get from coming here?
Well, first of all, I think they'll get a very friendly welcome. That's one thing about the Irish, and I've travelled a lot of the world myself, and there's no comparison whatsoever to an Irish welcome than there is to anywhere else in the world. That's the first thing they'll get. They'll feel that they're at home, they'll enjoy themselves, because we're full of laughter and song, the Irish, and maybe sometimes we're a bit too heavy for light work and too light for heavy work, but however, we do love people.
We've got a big celebration coming up with the 90th anniversary. If people come to Youghal next year, what will they find?
The sky's the limit. Absolutely. We're going out of our way this year, completely out of our way, to celebrate our parents' 90th year in business. They will be having parades, huge barbecues, huge fun fairs, I mean really big fun fairs, entertainment, stage characters, you know, everything from that would cover from 1 to 101 and entertain them to the last.
I cannot tell you how much I'm looking forward to that and really rekindling my memories of Perky Bear and all the times I spent in Perks over the years. Sal, Tivy, Perk, thank you so much for joining us and happy birthday.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Next up, I want to speak with Leah Ryan, who is the lady behind the East Cork Visitor's Guide, which is your one-stop shop if you're travelling to Ireland and you get to visit this wonderful part of our island. Leah, how are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Tell me a little bit about yourself, first of all. Where are you from?
I'm from North Cork originally, but now I do live in East Cork. I live in Youghal for about 3 or 4 years. I'm there.
And when you got to Youghal, what did you make of it? Because it's a fascinating historic town.
It really is, yes, and that's like really evident. You can't, but know that even just walking through the town, But I just totally fell in love with the place. Like, I mean, you're right there on the coast, you have like the birds and the ocean and the sky. It's just amazing. You have all that history. There's so much to do there. There's so much to see. There's the clock tower, you can just go for endless walks around the town and just, there's so many nice cafes and restaurants and lovely friendly people. And it's just, it's just something that Ireland is just great at. It's like a teeny little place, full of history, full of amazing things to do. And sometimes it's forgotten or overlooked, but it's still all there and it still has so much to offer.
What I love to see is when you get the busload of tourists who come in and they get off the bus and they have no idea where they're walking around. And the good thing about having a guide like this is at least they're not walking around in a vacuum, that they have the information that's there. So what's in there about the history and the things to do?
Everything. So in the East Cork Visitors Guide, it focuses on the main 3 towns in East Cork. So you got Youghal, Middleton and Cove. And each of those places has its own history and has its own walking tours and, you know, historians that will take you around and stuff like that. There's loads of options for each of those towns. So in East Cork and in Youghal, you can see the clock gate. You can...
Tell about the clock gate, because you've mentioned it now.
Yeah.
To those who've never seen the clock gate, what is the clock gate?
It's on the main street. You drive through it. It joins North. You have North Main Street and South Main Street like that. So it's right in the middle. It used to be a prison. There's so much other history in it. You can read about it all in here. You can check
But
us
I mean,
out
it
on
wasn't
social
built in
media.
the 1960s. It was
1700s. It was built. Yeah.
So it has a lot of history behind
Definitely
it.
a lot of history. Yeah.
What do Americans like about this part of Cork, which in some ways it might be viewed as the less travelled parts of the county, but when they get there, what do they love?
I think it's all the history, as I said, you know, like in Youghal you have the town hall, the town walls, you have Walter Raleigh lived there, you know, you have all these amazing places in the Collegiate Church. Then you get to Middleton and you have the Jameson Distillery, and that has so much history and connections.
And I can't imagine why anyone would want to go to a distillery on their holidays, but there's also an American link in Middleton, isn't there?
There is the Choctaw Indian sculpture. It's a memorial built there, and yeah, lots of reasons to come.
And then if you stay in East Cork and you go down as far as Cove, there's such huge links.
Exactly,
between
yeah,
Ireland
with the
and
Titanic and the Lusitania, absolutely.
Yeah, and the Lusitania, of course, the reason why the Americans joined the First World War.
Yes, yeah.
I mean, look, as Irish people, you know, we take it all for granted, don't we? We just assume that this is always the way it has been.
Yeah.
And it's the same way if we go, I mean, if I think of the times I've been to Hyannis and I walk around and look at the historic buildings, it's the same for the Americans coming here, except it's just that little bit older.
Yeah.
I mean, you talk about witch trials. There was a witch trial in Youghal, if you want to go back that far as well. I mean, there's so much to enjoy.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
So where can people get this? When they come to East Cork and they come to Youghal, how can they get the guide?
It will be in the airport. It'll be in hotels spread around East Cork. You can download it if you can't get to any of those places. It's free to download on the website, and we've great dedicated social media as well with it on Facebook and Twitter and what have you, and all the great communities, you know, spread across East Cork, all have like dedicated social media presence as well. So everything is like available, you know, and it's all there just to discover.
So just remind me again, what's the website and how can people find it?
It's www.eastcork.ie.
Well, Leah Ryan of the East Cork Visitors Guide, which is produced by Flanagan Print, you will be there welcoming everybody off every bus and every hire car in Youghal over the next few months. Thank you so much for joining us.